We are about to start the second panel. If we could ask our students who are with us to please come forward, come down if you will, and join us. Those students who are here, huh? 3. No, you're supposed to sit here. She's there. If I could ask the students who are with us and our colleagues to please come down. Hey, hey. Thank you, Dr. Morris. Thank you, thank you. The first panel was everything that we expected it to be, and we're now going to go into our second panel, and we're just deeply honored to have with us 3 individuals who have been leaders in the higher education community for years, both as faculty members, as leaders of organizations that serve the interests of HBCUs, as well as distinguished president of one of our institutions. I'm going to moderate this panel. I'm going to try to stay as far away from their space as possible and initiate dialogue among them. I'll make a brief comment about each one of them and then pose an initial question, and hopefully they can proceed from there. First is Leslie Baskerville. Thank you, Dr. Attorney Baskerville, for being with us. She is actually the 5th and first female president and CEO of the National Association of Equal Opportunity in Higher Education, NAFIO. It is the only national advocacy and capacity building association for our nation's 105 historically black colleges and universities. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors from Douglas College and Rutgers University in 1998. And she's also a member of the Douglas Society, which is the college's Hall of Fame. She holds a Juris Doctorate from Howard University School of Law and an honorary doctorate from Bennett College. Thank you, Attorney Baskerville, for being with us. Next to her is a colleague of ours, a long-serving member of the Howard University faculty, Professor Lorenzo Morris. He always insists that we know that he's a graduate of Fisk University, the beginning and the end institution. Dr. Morris is a distinguished member of our faculty. Actually, he's the leader of the faculty senate here at Howard University. He's a long-serving member of the Department of Political Sciences, former chair, a noted leader in the black politics area discipline, and you see him commenting on major issues of the day, both in international as well as national issues. Dr. Morris, thank you for being with us today. And finally, Professor and President Earl S. Richardson, who is President and Professor Emeritus of Morgan State University, where he was the 11th President of Morgan State University, serving from 1984 until 2010. He's a Maryland native and a graduate of the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. He's just such a central player in the future of HBCUs, and most noted for leading the jurisprudence debate and discussion about how HBCUs will be treated both by state and federal governments. And President Richardson, we thank you for your unique leadership on that and look forward to your comments about that. In fact, I want to lead off with a question regarding that for both of you, for the 3 of you, and that is, what is your assessment of the constitutional environment within which HBCUs exist and the jurisprudence that affects their ability to compete and to educate and serve their students? And please, at your leisure, either one of you.
I'm going to defer to the attorney, and then I'll give you the late.
Yes, thank you.
And I'd like to answer
That's fine.
I think it's vitally important that although at least one of our
Could you use
presidents,
the mic, Les?
I'm sorry, although at least one of our presidents thought that now is the time to talk about the individual value proposition of our colleges and universities, there's some real reasons, legal, legislative, and otherwise, that we should not. So HBCUs were established as a class by the United States Congress. And the Congress created this class of historically black colleges and universities in recognition of the nation's sorry history of segregation, discrimination, and so forth, recognizing that Africans in America had not gotten access to the opportunities in education as others. And so our institutions were founded for the progeny of the American slave system to offer them access to excellent education. And they've done that down through the years and to the present. And so when we talk about value proposition, we're looking at a class of 105 historically black colleges and universities that are enrolling 300,000 students. They're just 3% of American colleges and universities. But in terms of the value proposition of the group, they're graduating disproportionate numbers of African Americans in the growth and high needs areas. And so in order to stay into existence, we talk about the class. We have to talk about the class. Just 3% of American colleges and universities are graduating about 22% of all African Americans with undergraduate degrees in the sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM, growth areas. They are today graduating 50% of African American teachers, a sorely needed area. They're graduating 60% today of African American health professionals and increasing numbers of African Americans in the environment and security. And so this is what the value proposition is as a class. And at a time when the nation is grappling with how do you make college affordable and accessible, HBCUs are leading the way. HBCUs, private HBCUs, according to the College Board, on average, are $10,000 less per year than their historically white counterpart. Public HBCUs are about $2,500 less per year than their historically white counterparts. So we've got this rich class of colleges and universities that are doing a better job of graduating African Americans in the growth and high needs areas than any others. If we start to decouple them and talk just about individual value propositions, we stand to lose them as a group. Howard University, that was created by Congress separately, Howard University and Gallaudet, in recognition of their unique missions, Howard's to have a place to educate African Americans, but that's separate authorization, appropriation, and of Congress. But the rest of the 104 historically black colleges will no longer exist if there is not deemed to be this class of richly diverse colleges and universities serving the nation in unique ways. So we can't lose the class.
Yeah, I think that was the proper introduction of that.
Okay.
Let me just make a comment first about our previous panelists. Listening to them should be a reaffirmation for all of us of the great talent that resides in our historically black colleges and universities. So many times, that is at question now, that with all the challenges that our universities are facing, somehow it has been interpreted to be the leadership. Well, I was president for 26 years, and before that served the president for, I guess, about 5 years before that, and then a central administration before that, or after that. And after being at a historically black college, the value proposition is evident in not only all of our students, but in us also. That's where we came from. We've gone to some of the most prestigious universities in the country after leaving those black colleges. And now we have come to head our universities, and somehow we're not seen as competent, as capable as those graduating from other schools who run our predominantly white institutions. Well, I was a student of higher education much before I was a student of higher education, if that makes sense to you. Because as I was growing up in the system, I went to an undergraduate HBCU, and as I was doing that, I was watching and observing all the way up. And one of the things that we heard all the time was what our black institutions were not, rather than what they were. That was foreign to me because it wasn't the experience that I was having of my own. I had a quite different experience than what I was reading about or hearing about. And so when I came to become the president of a university, I was determining that we were never going to let any of those negative things happen to us, and that I was going to do everything that anyone wanted to be. I heard some discussion about best practices. I heard one presentation, and then I heard another that was put into perspective about that whole issue of best practices. Best practices are based on the conditions and circumstances that you're faced with. And what I came to understand very well, that with all of our vision, with all of our talent, it was for naught unless we have equitable resources. And our institutions don't have equitable resources, never have, and have not to this day been given equitable resources. And what I devoted myself to, or determined that if I had any legacy at all, if I were going to look for the future of our historically black colleges, then we were going to have to address the issue of the inequities in resources and facilities and faculty and all the other things. And so that has taken us to what is now the subject at hand, and that is the litigation that's in Maryland. I would say to those who are private institutions that while this is in the public sector, it has everything to do with us all. Because the way we are perceived, the publics are perceived, will have an impact on how all of us are perceived at the federal government as well as at our state governments. And so I have determined that in the state of Maryland, we have never dismantled yet the dual system of higher education. And for a long time, it was just my word against theirs. The power structure was saying, yes, you have everything, and you are just not performing. Well, we did everything. We applied all the best practices. We tried to be like Howard. That's a statement for Howard. And still, while we did great things and we turned out all the great persons that you heard our good presidents talk about, it pales in comparison to what we are capable of doing if, in fact, we had the resources. And so we have challenged the state in court in a lawsuit that said that you are in violation of the Constitution, and guess what? They never thought we could do it. Because it takes a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a simple thing that I hope our historically black colleges infuse more than anyone else, and that is courage. The courage to lead. After all is said and done, we can have the vision. If you don't have the resources and don't have the courage to say it, then you're not going to get very far. And so all that I've done and all that I'm saying and all that the judge has joined me in saying now is, Maryland, you are operating in violation of the Constitution of the United States, and you better fix it. Well, the task is not over yet. And what happens in Maryland is being watched across this country. Because what has happened in Maryland is they have misinterpreted what desegregation meant. They thought it meant just to desegregate our white institutions and leave our black institutions to die on the vine. No, 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 no. It said you desegregate all of your public institutions. And if that means an infusion of dollars to make them comparable and competitive with the best universities in this country, that's what you have to do. So that they are inviting, talking about preserving that uniqueness about our institution, so that they are inviting to students regardless of race. Does that mean we will no longer be predominantly black? I don't think so in America. But what it will say is, you are open, you can make the choice, and that those who do make the choice do not have to sacrifice quality of education or quality of life when they come. That's how we preserve our institution. And you heard the word transformative many, many times this morning, and what a good word it is. Because you don't just see the condition and understand that it's there. You get out and do something about it. You sue them.
Dr. Morris.
Thank you. I will be brief. But I'm happy that Leslie Baskerville started off by emphasizing the constitutional background of HBCUs in terms of national interest in national government. And Dr. Richardson's comments reminded me of a once famous case, U.S. versus Fordyce, in which something struck me as amazing, drawing on constitutional history in black colleges, and that is Clarence Thomas made a decision that I liked. And outside of the normal pattern, he said there must be something here that says even if we adjust for some levels of inequality, HBCUs have viability. Regrettably, that was the last time he said anything that I liked. But it was important, that one flashback into a constitutional history. I think that the point to be made about this is something that has both praise and criticism for the future, which is that with this founding, where the national government in some ways particularly focused on some institutions that were given a charter, but generally around the country, local and state governments looked at the idea that HBCUs were to do something. And we always thought of that something as helping the blacks that were going to come into society. But in my view, it was also something to help the nation, to stabilize it. And that need is still there. The idea of post-racial in a society which has been dutifully trashed is significant because you can't say the words unless you can talk about a post-unequal society, a society of perfect equality. What HBCUs do, they do for the nation and for African Americans. I was this weekend, I had a joyous experience. I ate at the CIA, the Culinary Institute of America in my hometown. And I thought about that as we paid $100 and some for macaroni and cheese. And I thought, and then my sister who invited, well, how good it was. Now the CIA, over 30 or 40 years, it's world famous now, the Culinary Institute that is, has generated an image of its product as something that the nation needs. And of course we need food, so it's consistent. What HBCUs to some extent have conceded when they shouldn't is that what we define as higher education is the model for an essential element of the nation. And how does that relate to the CIA? It is because no nation, unlike the other countries, no other institutions in this country, unlike in other countries, take as an essential part of their mission a national mission. We have that essential part. No other group of institutions look at equity and inequity and disperse it across the realm of knowing and things to be known, whether it is studying blood compositions in medicine or art, developing, understanding jazz, or certainly inequality, whether it's to define a civil rights case as a civil rights case. When desegregation couldn't be distinguished from integration, both were thrown out. And when we found a pattern of getting to one without the other, those things are not old things, those are new things. Defining what the challenge of voting rights is a function of understanding equity. In all areas of science, humanities, and social science, those are still there. But if you, I'm having done some work on race in France, they have institutions which claim that role in the government of force. Here we don't. That we don't, except to the extent that HBCUs can, and we need to reaffirm that role so that when we go for grants and when we go for grants in science, we say balance in the fields of science is required. Entity, somebody mentioned MIT. When I was teaching at MIT, one of the things that I noticed is they never went for a grant. It didn't seem to me. Most of the big grants they went for were grants out there. They went to the government institution to find what needed to be researched, and then they allowed them to apply. Meaning they allowed the governments to give them the grants to which they could apply. Howard University, Morehouse, Spelman, Fisk, all of the others can to some degree collaborate in the articulation of the values that our nation has, and we can't do that uniquely or in some ways, but we can take a leadership role that no other institutions are prepared to take.
Now, my colleagues, I'm particularly interested in your views on the topic of this weekend, and that is endowing the mission and addressing how we can leverage the political presence of the black community to endow our institutions. Are we doing a good job of that? Can we do more? How can we do more? Obviously, the endowment question is a major one. We are a multi-billion-dollar presence in this country, but it doesn't seem to be reflected in the endowment of our institutions. How can we leverage that better?
Well, yeah, so just in terms of pure numbers, the HBCUs as a community, as a collective, have a short-term value in numbers of $13 billion, short term, and so that's what it contributes to the community's faculty, staff, short term. It does not reflect the value of the graduates and what you add in terms of stabilizing the nation, as Dr. Morris talked about. But I'm going to put that into context, and then I'll answer your question. So in terms of our $13 billion short-term value, the Bank of America has a $10 billion short-term business. Value, short-term. HBCUs hire 188,000 faculty. Bank of America, which is the 23rd or was the 23rd largest industry in America, has 177,000 employees. So we've got 188,000. We've got 13 billion. They're at 10 billion. We're at, and they have 177. So in terms of value proposition, if Bank of America is the 23rd or around the 23rd largest industry, you can understand in numbers the impact of HBCUs in terms of stabilizing the nation. Not only that, but as the population of America is increasingly black and brown, increasingly low-income, first-generation, HBCUs have done and are continuing to do a better job of anyone of graduating, enrolling and graduating African Americans and others who are traditionally underserved, under-resourced, other persons of color, low-income, first-generation students. So we have a model that's working. America, back to Dr. Morris's point, America will not realize its goals, its education goals of having 60% of Americans with a 2 or 4 year degree by 2020 without HBCUs at the center. HBCUs are educating and graduating the students that our country is targeting. So in terms of endowing the mission and so forth, I wasn't sure in this context what endowing it meant, so I read a little bit and I concluded that it meant to guard their futures against the claims of the present. And that was pulling on James Tobin, who's a renowned economist. I tried to get to Bill Spriggs, who was the past dean of the economics department here, and our economist, I couldn't reach him, but that's one thought. And the other is maintaining the core values that define HBCUs and keeping them stronger for the future. And so your question then, Dr. Thornton, is how do we do that? How do we maintain the core qualities that define HBCUs and keep them stronger for the future. And I think we have to do that in two ways. One is register and vote and get everyone that you can to register and vote. And the other is to amass our economic strengths. We have an expendable income of $1 trillion, and it's projected in the next 3 years to go up to $1.3 trillion as an African American community. So on the issue of registering and voting, HBCU students, families, alumni, and the HBCU community has more reason to register to vote than anyone. I talked about the fact that HBCUs are founded by Congress, and Congress can take us away. What that founding does is it has funds attached with it. All of our HBCUs get a flat base of funds in recognition for the facts that Dr. Richardson talked about, the inequality in funds because of this nation's history of segregation, discrimination, and its lingering remnants today. So there are provisions in Congress that provide for support for our black health centers, for black hospitals, for development of STEM, teaching education, every single area in which our students are thriving and growing. Congress invests dollars in that in recognition of the fact that our schools are vitally important and they haven't. So we've got to register and vote. Howard University, that gets a $200 million base appropriation from Congress on average, has an even greater responsibility and need to get out and vote. And so we've got to vote. We've got to vote in off elections like the election this year, in which Congress will turn over, and vote for people, regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, but vote for people who will go to Congress and vote your interests. We have to do the same things at the state level, as Dr. Richardson talked about what's going on in the states, and most of the action with regard to higher education takes place in the states. He talked about the Maryland case. What is going on in Maryland is going on in every other state where we have dual and unequal higher ed systems. So we've got to have state legislators that will recognize the value of HBCUs and invest in those institutions. Then the second thing we have to do is amass our dollars. We have $1 trillion spending ability to spend in the black community. We put our dollars in the wrong things. Imagine if we took that $1 trillion and we invested in $1 billion fund, HBCUs are us, and that the fund was to strengthen the infrastructure of HBCUs so that we can build libraries, so that we can have technology in every space on our campuses and other things. If we amassed some percentage of our dollars, we can do that. And in fact, NAFIO has a proposal now. We have talked with a number of very wealthy individuals. We've talked with corporations and others to launch such $1 billion fund. And I'm not going to talk about it anymore now. I know we're supposed to do Q&A, but at some point I'd love to talk with you about it, and I'd like for Howard University and Morehouse University to be the first partners in HBCUs Are Us, $1 billion fund built with funds from friends and others, but certainly maintained, sustained, and grown with our own dollars.
I'm sure Dr. Richardson is going to insist that more can be a part of that.
Yeah.
Morgan, we always want.
Dr. Richardson, please.
Well, whether or not, and I agree with what Leslie said here, but whether or not we're talking about endowing in its generic sense, that is the preservation into perpetuity, or whether or not we're talking about it in the economic sense of building the dollars. Basic and fundamental to black higher education is that black higher education has not been considered a part of the mainstream of the higher education industry in America. We have always been considered ancillary, at the margins. And it's because of that that our states have not invested in it. Our federal government has not invested in it. And if they do not invest in it, the best way you preserve the institution and its values to society is to build it, to grow it, to make it an integral part of the economic engine that drives this country, the intellectual industry that drives this country. And until we do that, until we force the the hand of the power structure. And look, 25, 30 years ago, if I thought I'd be talking like this, Alvin, I would not have seen. But this is what 25, 30 years of being in the driver's seat will do to you. The legal challenge was not our first impulse. It was to be excellent, to be great, to do the things that are necessary to make sure that the young people we graduate are among the best, the leaders, as you heard just a few minutes ago, the people who will transform society. That's the vision. But the vision won't take place. You heard this expression, no money, no mission. That is as true as it sounds on the face of it. When you try to do the things that we know both intuitively and through our preparation, what needs to be done to make sure we turn out those black leaders, to turn out other leaders. But if you don't have the resources, and in this country, it begins with the contributions of government, if we're talking education. Let's just talk any one community. I heard President Frederick, and he's so right. I loved his perspective on how you become a facilitator for the community. I don't know if you noticed there was a difference in perspective on that, and it was very good just to hear the debate. One from the social end and what we should be doing, who we ought to be, and how we should be transforming the community around us. And another, and I know not intended at all.
Not from a Morehouse man.
That's right, that's right. Just a perspective, but it was from the the public safety standpoint. Well, that is too often times the approach, and that's what gets us in trouble. It's from that social standpoint that we have our greatest value. And I love that perspective that was brought onto the table. But what I'm about to say is, if you look at our institutions as engines of change, of engines of transformation, as economic engines in our community, as engines of development, the first contributors are government. And that then is leveraged to corporate and private. It's when people see what you're doing for them, how you are transforming their community and their lives, that they buy into who you are and your value to them. And then they vote for you. They make sure they fight for you. So the way we endow our universities is to first insist that we recognize within the political structure of this country as equal partners in the higher education enterprise. Howard, Morgan, Morehouse, and all of the rest. Equal partners. And when we're investing, we're not talking about building our majority institutions to attract our best and our brightest black students. We're talking about building all of our public institutions so that they're equally attractive to students regardless of race. Then we become important. We become a part of the mainstream of higher education, and that's where we have to insist. And once you have been accepted as equal partners, it then drives public policy. Public policy drives dollars. That dollars then leverage new dollars and continues to, and that's the vision we have to have. So I don't approach it from the standpoint of our not having the talent in our own community, our not knowing what the value proposition is. It is having the resources to deliver on the value proposition.
Dr. Morris, one of your most noted books, Blacks in Higher Education. Can you draw upon that research and expand on this question?
I don't know if I can expand. I can just make a brief comment.
Yeah.
I like the fact that Dr. Frederick brought up the point that you have just reiterated, because I think that begins with 2 points. One, from my political science perspective rather than higher education, a famous quote from Tip O'Neill that all politics is local. I would like to think that all choices in higher education that affect the political community are also local, even if they reach to West Africa. And part of that has to do with how we set a framework or a set of choices. The original European in the 1500s concept of the university was to serve the community. That got upped and down and transformed over the centuries. One of the problems, I think, of HBCUs has been the constraints of the uplift of the talented tends to be insular from the community. We may respond sympathetically, even charitably, historically, but never with the sense that we have a powerful determining role in how that community develops around us. And I think that's part of the weakness in the dollar signs. In the past, when states have allocated funding, it has often been described as a kind of indirect reparations, even though I don't think that's what it was. And I think it was never described as a kind of adjustment to the needs of the community. Where we are now is illustrated, I think, a little bit by the way in which money is available when it's available. And sometimes a lot of it is in the diaspora, that is outside of the immediate community. But if you look at where universities have gotten inputs, HBCUs, and I think the Wrangle Fund is one of them, it's because there was an interest proximate to the university on which we could draw by personal contacts or by others. There was a story in the paper today about some person in the computer industry and gaming, and he went to his alma mater in Maryland. And he had noticed that their computer labs were horrible. It was just on the Post today, and so he gave them, promised $31 million. I think somehow there's a deception there that we make into a rule. He looked at it and saw a personal relationship and then gave them $31 million. People often think that if you badly need money in a higher education, you're going to get it. I think that's the opposite of what happens. You have to show that there are needs for money that aren't visible that need to be met, and we have been hesitant to do that. I think both collaboratively, as Leslie has suggested, and individually, we have to start projecting programs and insisting on them through our community allies. And you say, who are our community allies? They are to some extent, as Dr. Frederick talked about, helping people in the neighborhood, and every institution that I can think of, based on my research experience, their universities have not drawn on the political community locally to reach to the community nationally. I don't think there has been a person at Howard who's done any work abroad where he hasn't encountered somebody with some financial resources who's interested in developing a relationship, but it's always impossible to do that unless you have a structured environment to do that. I think we need to be brave about structuring that environment. Historically, even when it comes to set-asides for African, since you asked about past research, it has always come in a context that is diminutive. What I mean, set-asides at the national level, or as with Title III or elsewhere, it means that it has come in the context of expanding government allocations to other institutions. So that part of it is good in the sense that the priority of needs which HBCUs express are seen, and then they're seen as needs for two-year colleges or for other kinds of special institutions. The difference is that we don't take ownership of it in a way that we need to do. The HBCU ownership, but also the national policy and state level agenda ownership. And that may require lobbying, but it may also require direct outreach to our, not only to our alums, which is obvious, but to the political community around us.
Now, Dr. Morris, I want to start with you on this question. The generation of faculty members that HBCUs uniquely produced, which helped to diversify American higher education, that generation is retiring out. It's dying. It's no longer available. How do we? You're not in that group. I mean, this is a late 1960s phenomenon. How do we replicate, duplicate? How do we restock that group of people with the same level of responsibility in orientation and style? The group that produced the black middle class helped to diversify America.
Well, that was actually before me. A lot of the faculty here today were the beneficiaries of the 40s generation and the 50s that gave them the money to protest and then to go on. If you look at applications to teach at HBCUs, to the extent that I can determine or have some access to them, they have not gone down from some of the best and brightest. The difference is our ability to respond. Some of it is investment. We can always get the best African-American scholars if we're willing to concentrate our focus. That doesn't mean that we have the money to pay everybody in a competitive way. But if we select some areas where we can do well as individual institutions or maybe collectively, and we give an emphasis to that, we can build around concentrations of both research and scholarship. I mean, there's some areas, and I'm looking at going over the fine arts where we've already had a historical leadership. There are some areas in political science, I hate to bring up our Nobel Prize, but since other people were, and our Nobel Prize worked at Howard as opposed to just get something later. And our Nobel Prize reached out to the world and solved an international problem in the Middle East, even if the resolution didn't stay for long. There are things that we can concentrate on and identify that other institutions may not be, and then we will get the faculty in those areas. True, we may still have the struggle in other areas where we can't concentrate, but I think from cores of excellence, as we've always talked about, we can retain and build a university. We will appeal to people if they have a secure future, and that's easy enough to do in some areas.
Dr. Richardson?
Yes, I guess I wholeheartedly agree with you. As a matter of fact, every morning I walk through my house, I look at artwork all over the place from Elizabeth Catlett. And that may be a name here at Howard. But in either case, I have to tell you, we operate in a world now where faculty too have choices. And faculty want to know the best place that they can exercise their craft. Who's going to provide the greatest resources? Who's going to have the best facilities? Who's going to pay the decent salaries? It comes down to having the resources to compete with the best for the best. And when I went to Morgan, that was one of the things I said. I don't want my faculty being paid less than my competitors. And so I'm going to fight for that. That's what I said when I went there. Didn't succeed because it wasn't my final decision. But we certainly moved in that direction. My basic point is, after all is said and done, it comes down to the almighty dollar. And if you don't have some semblance of equity there, you're going to find it very difficult, if not impossible, to attract that continuing set of talent. See, we didn't have to deal with that. I heard some conversation about the new norm. Well, one of the new norms is they have choices. And make no mistake about it, our competitors will pay them. Yes, it is good for us to say, well, you have to have a commitment to the black cause. I think many people now believe that they can serve the black cause if they can serve their families well, if they can serve their children well, and that's where they're going. So again, I say, we have to come back to ensuring that our institution get their due. I understand what is happening in terms of our overall economy. But what dollars there are available, we've got to have a realignment of that. We've got to have a reallocation of that so that it is equitable. That if we're suffering from the economy, we're suffering alike. Not I having a cold and somebody else having pneumonia. And that's what this challenge of mine is all about. Really, if you think that just money will do it, no, it won't. But you got to start with money if you're going to do the vision. Yes, you have to have the vision. And I think there's no lack of vision among our black colleges. I think it is more a function of resources than it is a lack of vision.
of the things that our country does is it establishes and funds mentorship programs and programs for identifying faculty and others who we need in high needs disciplines. It seems to me that the models that we have developed in going down to middle schools and identifying women, in particular girls, who we want to put on a trajectory to going into the sciences and technology and following them through, or African Americans, Hispanics, and others who we want to bring into the fold on STEM, we could look at that model in terms of keeping a pipeline of HBCU faculty. When I think of HBCU faculty, of course, you've got to be excellent in your discipline. But in addition to that, the things that make HBCU faculty different are their passion to educating, sometimes the last, the least, the locked out, the left behind, and certainly also those who are the most prepared and those who are of greatest advantage. And they have a gift of being able to reach persons on both ends of the spectrum. They also have the fortitude. They've got faith. They've got faith that in spite of the things that Dr. Richardson talks about we lack because we don't have the resources, they are going to give the students that are in their classes and students that they meet on the street the types of education that they could get in the most wealthy institutions. And so they've got this faith and fortitude, a passion for transforming the lives of others and the connectivity between community and campus that we call Communiversity. So what if we partnered with the National Association of Black School Educators, NABSE, and asked their members to identify students who are not just interested in teaching, but students who, with the right interventions, may want to be part of an HBCU faculty. And we put some dollars in there that can be philanthropic dollars or federal dollars, and followed them and worked with them, mentored by current faculty who are model faculty and taken through the pipeline so that we have this cohort that understands what it means to be the best of HBCU faculty and also has the mentoring and the appropriate resources to realize their dream.
Dr. Morris, would you consider a completely alternative model or approach for financing higher education for students? I mean, our model is kind of medieval, isn't it? Would you consider an alternative model for doing it?
I hope you're not expecting me to come up with a model on the spur of the moment.
I am.
Well, I don't want to embarrass you by actually doing it. So
yeah.
let me just comment on when I first came here. I was at the.
No, I said that, Dr. Morris. Let me just say, because there are some schools, Dr. Richardson, Dr. Morris, that if your family makes less than $100,000, and if you get admitted, you have no financial obligation at all. Now, there are schools that do that, right? You know that, and I do. Why can't that concept be expanded as a national concept?
Well, first of all, we'd end up paying for most of Howard faculty children.
That's fine.
But
That's fine. That's fine. But it's a serious model. So
yeah,
the question is,
I think that's a model worth considering, and there are possibilities. There are some in the world who are interested in the endowment community in promoting that, and there might be an appeal for that. But it still has a slight hint of charity unless it's done in the right way, and charity tends to have its limits.
Okay.
I think that when higher education finance was reformed, going back to Carter, there was an attempt to sort of bring more people into the eligibility level for things like Pell Grants and loans, but it also expanded at the middle class level, so you had a kind of balanced political participation for it. What I think the model for HBCUs might be is to look at the political debate that surrounded the expansion of higher education from the early 80s to the present, with a special focus on how we as private and quasi-private, meaning public, but can influence it. One is the loans, for example. Remember when there was a big problem with the PLUS loans? HBCUs influenced the redefinition of it. I think resources, if limited on the family level, can be addressed that way. You talked about universities paying. Obviously, if Howard could pay more for its students, we would. But Howard has limited resources. There may be ways of restructuring the program a little bit more extended. Rather than rushing to get people out in 4 years, it may be possible to have recurring or a part-time structure in which people can work and come back if they can't pay all of the money. I think the critical model, however, has to be to get to the idea that the universities will reinforce low-income student scholarships. But that model has to be varied by some other modes of teaching. I don't think online teaching is a solution, though that may be part of a part-time approach. The reason it's not a solution is because obviously the cost factors can be as intense, and you may ultimately dilute the approach. So that the idea, I think the best bets are increasing the ways in which funding can be acquired. I'm not talking about just scholarships, but also loans and a variety of things. And secondly, and perhaps, is to change the way in which the curriculum is delivered so that both extended and part-time education is a possibility.
And debt forgiveness is a part of that, higher education debt forgiveness. Any comments on that? Dr. Richardson?
As a matter of fact, as you remember, the National Defense Act was intended to do that, but again, as the economy went, so many of these policies went. But I think that one thing has to be accepted right up front. If we're going to provide equal opportunity, we're going to have to accept the notion that government must make up the difference between what families and students have to pay and what the cost of higher education is. Otherwise, you can't have equal opportunity. Meaning that if you have some students who are at a lower socioeconomic level and cannot pay, let's say 60% of the cost, and we can't come in conceding that we hold tuition levels down and we give more financial aid, because there's a limit to that. There's a cost for holding tuition down. Tuition is one of the primary sources of funding for an institution. And if you're holding it down, you're discounting it, then that means that you're not bringing some resources to the institution to operate that you should be bringing. Somebody has to make that up. Then we say in the public sector, we say the state is giving each of the public institutions the same amount of money. But if you're serving different populations that are at different socioeconomic levels, should you be giving them the same amount of money, or should you be making up the difference? Because there is a difference between what it costs for education and what the federal government is now paying, and the student has to supplement that. So we have to buy into the notion that equal opportunity can oftentimes mean inequitable appropriations, with that being on the side of the historically black colleges and the students they serve.
Now, Attorney Baskerville and colleagues, I must ask you all this question. There was a question that I presented to you all regarding the efforts to purchase the voices of HBCUs. What's your comment on that? The Koch brothers' contributions, other less than moderate groups. Talk to us about that phenomenon. It's a very difficult phenomenon, obviously. It's caused some discussion in our community. What would be your comments about that?
Well, I think it's very, very interesting, but I think we should see it for what it is. I think we're in a very difficult time in terms of our economy and its impact on our historically black colleges. I think that there are those who understand that vulnerability and say, in the midst of this vulnerability, we can now cultivate some populations to our position. I don't divorce it from what happened with Senator Cochran in Mississippi.
Right.
I think it's one and the same. But what I do think is that those on the other side should be saying, we understand what this is directed toward. We understand the vulnerability of our black colleges. What this means then, that rather than us saying wholesale, give it back, is saying you give it back, and rather than giving you $25 million, we're going to give you 100 million. We're going to begin to design programs and budgets at the federal level to ensure that you don't have this vulnerability. And we, in turn, then understand who is really coming to the table, and then we vote. This is as political as politics can be. And if we who are on the other side of that political divide don't understand that it was not just out of the goodness of the Koch brothers' heart that they gave 25 million, it was with an agenda. And it's that agenda that we ought to be most concerned with, because it has implications far beyond education. It has to do with whether or not we can be bought for a price, and whether or not those that are on the other side, our side, are willing to ensure we don't have that vulnerability.
Dr. Morris, Dr. Morris?
You know, you're really referring to a specific set of incidences. And I think that those set of instances go first to how strong your voice is, and secondly, to how much they're willing to pay. Let's start with the second one. Nobody's willing to pay enough. Right. So, you know, 25 million is not enough to get to the next month in a reasonable way. And so nobody's willing to pay enough. But the reason it looks like they're getting something is because sometimes the institutional voices aren't as clear as they perhaps should be. On this stage, we had a senator come last year, I believe, and to use the Howard presence to show the world that he wasn't a conservative reactionary who had voted against the Civil Rights Act, a certain Rand Paul. But the students showed with their voices that they were willing to listen, but they weren't deceived. And he didn't offer any money, but he wanted something from us. But our voices were louder than his demand. I think that part of the problem is not the offering of the money. It is that it can come in the circumstances in which the agenda of those organizations or institutions which receive it is obscure, so that we can accept the money only after it's perfectly clear the range of our expectations, our policy or agenda. And what makes us vulnerable now is because we whisper.
So if we register and vote regularly, often and early, and bring all of our extended family to vote, we would not be in a position where we have to make what some perceived as a Hobson's choice and some perceive as buying the voices of HBCUs. And then if we amass our own wealth and target it toward the sustaining institutions in our communities, HBCUs, we wouldn't be in that position. The Koch brothers discussions that resulted in the $25 million came on the heels of a 3-year tremendous decline in dollars to HBCUs, where HBCUs lost hundreds of millions of dollars. On average, each HBCU lost roughly $5 million, an average of 200 to 300 students per campus, because the Parent Plus loan that had been stopgap money for our parents who have undergraduate students and for our graduate students, they shifted the regulations with regard to Parent Plus loan. Howard was hit hard too. I'm sure many of you remember. Howard lost or stood to lose about 200 students, but to the credit of Howard alumni and the then president who put in place the GAP fund, we were able to bring back many of our students, if not all of them. But across the country, where most HBCUs are much smaller than Howard University, our HBCUs, and especially the private institutions, were on their knees, and many of them facing dire situations. And so it was and along with that, at the same time the Parent Plus loan money dried up for us because of the shift in regulatory interpretation, Congress made a decision that it would limit the numbers of months that students could be on Pell Grant. It cut out the summer Pell Grant that allowed many of our students who want to work and have to work and do other things to go to school year-round, and made some other decisions. That also happened at the time when the Department of Education saw an error it made in awarding dollars to HBCUs, and in some instances, it took back about $250,000. So as you can hear, we're not talking about hundreds of millions, but it doesn't take hundreds of millions of dollars to be pulled from our community for many of our institutions to be backed up against the wall. But those things would not happen if we let our collective voices be heard on a regular basis on Capitol Hill, in state legislators, where the dollars, the base sustaining dollars are there. They could not shift take away the Pell Grant. A decision would not have been to limit the number of semesters you can be on a Pell Grant, take away summer Pell, if the 300,000 students that are enrolled in HBCUs alone, and it doesn't just impact HBCUs, all the students around, and most Pell eligible students are going to majority serving, and in fact they're other than African ancestry people. So if the students who are interested, who have Pell Grants to support their college tuition, let their voices be heard, we would not be in that position. So I can't underscore enough the value of our registering and taking people to Congress. And in fact, there is a requirement in the Higher Education Act that colleges and universities take affirmative steps to assist the students in registering to vote and going to vote. That's because 2/3 of American college students didn't vote in the last election. And when they were polled, it was determined that they didn't vote because many of them didn't know where to vote. So we've got to have voter education, voter registration, delivery to the polls, and then we have got to decide that it is vitally important to save the black colleges and universities as the anchor institutions of our community and invest in them as a family, an extended family.
Now we have maybe 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Anyone with a question before we continue our discussion? No questions from, yes, please.
No, I think it was an economic recognition that this country had cut out a broad and important swath of its citizenry very time, and that in order for this nation to realize its goals, it was going to have to do something to create an educational opportunity for the progeny of the American slave system, for African Americans. So the country determined that it was in its economic interest to bring these previously slave and indentured servants into the economy so that it could realize its goals. And so it was in that context that HBCUs were established. It was also in the context of maintaining segregation, right? Because the simple thing would be to have let African Americans go to any schools that they wanted to in the period just after the Civil War when HBCUs were established as a class. But that wasn't happening. So it was in the context of wanting to maintain the separate and unequal system at higher ed. And that allows me to just say that when Dr. Thornton asked the question about the constitutionality, I want everyone to know I'm very clear. I didn't answer the question of constitutionality. I wanted to answer another question. But just to get back to your question, with regard to the constitutionality in '54, when the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education, it did not decide higher education question. That came about and it was resolved as the result of negotiation much later, Adams versus Califano, where we put to the states the question of the unequal funding when Mary Frances Berry was the Secretary of Education. And NAFIO and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund pushed that through the channels, and ultimately it resulted in the Supreme Court accepting our negotiation that required that states invest in HBC, where they maintain dual and unequal systems, which is everywhere where you have HBCUs. They are to invest in HBCUs such that they're comparable to and competitive with their historically white colleges, and they've never done that. And then much later, Dr. Morris referenced already the Ayers decision, and that forms the legal predicate and created the constitutional history that gave rise to the Maryland case that Dr. Richardson talked about. But no, it certainly was not the governmental reparation.
Dr. Morris.
I'll tell you, I agree totally. But she reminds me of a story, which I have a second to share. I think at the same time, when I first came to Washington, the end of the Carter administration was considering responding to HBCU demands for more money in the Title III program, which is developing institutions. You notice the term in this universalistic language. And you know, one of the criteria to be used was how to decide what institutions would fit. So rather than say black colleges and others, they said institutions which had a certain percentage of students on Pell Grants. At the same time, college presidents were meeting about this in the White House, as I recall, or almost the same week. The Department of Education was looking at that criteria, increasing the Pell Grant as a definition of developing institutions. So what happened? The presidents got more money to the Title III grant, but many more schools, non-black, got into the eligibility so that black colleges got less. This is not to criticize a moment in history, but to point out one of the truths of national responses that takes it outside of the realm of reparations. If there's reparations, it's with inequality in the larger society. Black colleges were benefited because society needed them, and they needed them because we weren't prepared to deal with the other elements of inequality. Just think of the South at the time that the war, there was no public education for white people. They had no concept of education until the struggle of African Americans at all levels brought it into focus. And that is a national need. So even in the 1980s and now in the 2000s, when you get financial allocations, whether they're private or public, in part it responds to this kind of inequity that exists in the larger society. So if it is reparations, it is only for reparations within the white community, from which black colleges like the Miners Canary, as one of our scholars talked about, Lonnie Guinier talks about,
Right.
black colleges sing about or bring into focus for national interest those things, but they reimburse themselves.
Yes,
I just wanted to add, if it is reparations, it's not enough.
Yes.
My name is Barbara Simmons. I'm Dean of International Education at Sumner University, but having worked at
In Liberia,
yes, in Liberia,
the audience.
having worked at HBCU, first of all, I want to say that Dr. Richardson, you will always, every time I see you, I have to tell you how much I admire you, because I watched from afar how you enabled Morgan to be a state affiliated versus a state institution. And I was at a state institution and made all the difference in the world. And plus the resources that you were able to harness because of your political astuteness. It's just, you need to be training some other HBCU presidents on that. But could you, could all of you talk about the idea of education as a constitutional right? Because people think that we have a constitutional right to education, which there are some state constitutions that ensure it, but and if it's not a constitutional right for the United States, should we? Some I've had discussions where it was suggested maybe in terms of on an international realm we should address it as a human rights issue, and that might give us some further teeth in terms of pushing forward.
Well, let me say it's a constitutional right so far as I'm concerned, from the standpoint of the equal protection. If it's provided to the white majority, then we have a right to the same thing. Now, within our state budgets and whatnot, it is usually put in the category of discretionary funding, meaning that there's no entitled provision that says X number of dollars will go to higher education or X number of dollars will go to one institution or the other. So each year within the state budgets, it is debatable. It is subject to variation. There's nothing entitled about it. And so in that context, it is something that you can't depend on unless you have the political clout to influence the decisions each and every year. Now, if we had something like the Thornton legislation, then we'd be in good shape, you see. But we don't have anything like the Thornton legislation. And so it is subject to variation in any given year. So I would, from the standpoint, and Leslie is the lawyer here, she can talk about it more in terms of the legal responsibility, but at least from the equal protection side, as long as you provide it to any other race of people in the state, then it should be provided to us.
And Leslie, we have time for a very short response.
Okay, so there is no constitutional right to an education. There are a number of amendments pending in Congress. The first one was introduced by former Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., who is an esteemed constitutional lawyer. He and a gentleman by the name of Frank Watkins wrote a book in which they talk about a number of proposed constitutional amendments. One would be the right to an education of equal high quality. And because education is an imperative for a much broader swath of the American population in order for us to realize our economic and educational, ecumenical, social, culture, political goals, if that is something that students at Morehouse, at Howard, across other places across the country feel should be a constitutional right, then I would encourage you, and I would be happy to work with you to push that. We have some prototypes, and it would be a very important contribution from our students.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel for their participation. Last night we had our alumni Hbcus leadership panel, and it was very successful, well attended. Our freshman students particularly benefited from that. This morning we had the leaders of our two institutions engaged in a panel discussion led by Professor Kroom from our law school, and now we've had a panel of very distinguished scholars lead us in a discussion of endowing the mission of our institutions. Now this afternoon, please join us for the now famous Benjamin Mays Mordecai Wyatt Johnson debate. They'll debate issues related to Ferguson. Crampton will be packed, so get there early. It starts at 1 o'clock. And then on Saturday, please come to join us for the game at 3 o'clock. Thank you so much for your attendance.